Night presses over Lake Michigan. A Douglas DC-4 threads into a wall of weather, rain hammering the windshield, needles shivering on the panel. On June 24, 1950, the radio is routine, handoffs, acknowledgments, until a calm request to descend cuts through the static. Then nothing. No mayday. No flare of oil on the water by dawn. Over the next days, an armada will grid the lake, sweeping the very corridor the flight should have crossed, and return with almost nothing. If the plan and the search were sound, what did the storm and the night hide from everyone? Thesis. On the night of June 24, 1950, a massive, methodical search grid swept Lake Michigan and should have found a wreck. We'll rebuild the weather, the route, and the 1950 navigation limits to show why the search that should have worked didn't, and what the data says it missed. Northwest Orient Flight 2501 was a transcontinental night service in the early jetless era. Long legs, piston engines, and navigation ruled by radio beacons and dead reckoning. The aircraft that evening was a Douglas DC-4, a four-engined airliner built for range and reliability. Its cockpit laid out with big round dials, ADF needles, and low-frequency receivers tuned to the network of NDBs that ring the Midwest. The route crossed Lake Michigan after nightfall, a routine corridor when skies were stable and winds predictable. But on June 24, 1950, weather advisories warned of embedded thunderstorms, squall lines building and collapsing along the lake's western shore, and moderate to severe turbulence in convective bands. Surface observations spoke of strong gust fronts. Aloft, winds veered with height, the classic sign of a sheared environment. In 1950, crews did not have today's data link radar mosaics or glass panel storm displays. Situational awareness came from briefings before departure, en route radio updates, lightning glimpses, and what the needles in the altimeter were telling them. The crew, captain, first officer, and cabin attendants, worked the late schedule familiar to long-haul piston operations, high workload in weather, careful fuel management, and the calculus of comfort versus safety when turbulence bites. The company plan called for a cruise altitude high enough to clear most weather tops, with the option to step down if icing or severe bumps made the ride untenable. Fuel planning accounted for the lake crossing, an alternate, and reserves by the standards of the day. Air traffic procedures were likewise period accurate, handoffs between facilities by voice, position reports near compulsory fixes, and non-radar separation based on time and altitude. Against that backdrop, a calm request to descend was not unusual. Pilots descended at night to escape tops, find smoother air, or pick up stronger tailwinds. What mattered was where the descent began relative to storm structure and how the navigation needles behaved in convective interference. Those two variables would define the rest of the night. Minutes before the break in routine, instruments would have painted a tidy picture: altitude steady, power set for night cruise, heading tracking the planned lake crossing, and fuel on board within company margins for alternate and reserve. Position reports placed the aircraft near the western approach to the lake corridor, between beacon fixes that guided night traffic across open water. Winds aloft suggested modest drift, the sort a crew corrects with a couple of degrees on the compass and a mental note. Radios were busy but orderly. Handoffs, estimates, acknowledgments. If turbulence was present, it was manageable. Belts on, power tweaked, ride assessed. In other words, the flight still looked normal until the request to descend reset the calculus. The first crack in the smooth routine is small, a calm request to descend. It's the kind of call crews make on rough nights, an appeal for smoother air, for temperatures just warm enough to shrug off ice, or simply for a better ride below the worst of the tops. But the night over Lake Michigan is not a single sheet of weather. It's a stacked landscape, embedded cells, wind shifts, and rain shafts that hide their structure from a cockpit without modern radar. From the flight deck, the evidence arrives in fragments. The needle on the ADF quivers as lightning rips through the ionized air, then steadies, then wanders a hair again. The altimeter is honest. The horizon beyond the glass is not. In turbulence, the workload spikes. Power to maintain energy, pitch to hold attitude, heading corrections to fight drift. A descent promises relief, below the worst, and a cleaner path between cells that the crew can infer from rain intensity and the timing of flashes. The tower acknowledges. The airplane begins down. In that decision lives the night's pivot, the trait of vantage for comfort, of a broader view for a narrower margin, made reasonable by 1950s tools and made risky by 1950s limits. The descent begins shallow, power ease to keep cylinder, head temperatures happy, and airspeed in a comfortable pocket. Rain thickens from hiss to hammer. The windshield is a restless mirror. Lightning flares, then black. The ADF needle drifts a few degrees right, then creeps back as if ashamed to have wandered. In piston airliners, noise is the barometer of workload. The rumble deepens as the props bite slightly different air. The captain calls for belts tight and lights adjusted low. The first officer trims for the new attitude and makes the position report, voice steady. Below, the lake is simply absence. A line of embedded cells is angling along the shoreline, invisible as architecture yet legible in the cockpit as a set of contradictions. Vertical gusts that don't match the surface wind, rain intensity that rises and falls in odd cadence, and the ADF needle that hunts near the edge of the card whenever lightning cracks. Night sky wave from low-frequency beacons reaches inland over the water. The antenna hears both ground wave and sky wave and tries to split the difference. The crew knows this quirk. Every 1950s pilot did, but knowing a bias doesn't annul it. They hold heading by compass, treating the needle as advisory, cross-checking time and ground speed math in their heads. Turbulence steps up from nuisance to work. Loose items snick against metal. The yoke gets heavier in the captain's hand as he damps phugoids that the autopilot of the era would chase badly. The choice to continue down is logical. Reports often promised a smoother layer below the worst of the tops, and icing likelihood drops once temperature lifts a few degrees. The DC-4 is sturdy but honest. Get slow and it will tell you. Let the pitch wander and it will make you fix it. Power comes up a hair to hold energy in the bumps. The first officer works the chart, marking the minute where the next fix should be made at this ground speed, accepting that their cross-lake track may be a few degrees off, but survivably so. Over a late June lake, air masses argue. Warmer water can sustain updrafts that tilt and smear a squall line, while the gradient wind aloft veers with height. The airplane now samples a shear layer, sudden gains, then losses, then a gentle lull that tempts one to believe the worst is past. The captain's scan is disciplined, pitch, power, performance. Yet the human brain loves an apparent pattern. This feels better, someone might think, even as the ADF needle wanders again and the rain resumes its metallic tattoo. They angle for what their senses insist is a valley between cells. Non-radar procedures ask for time and distance discipline, but a night descent in weather erodes both. True airspeed shifts with temperature, ground speed with wind, and the mental E6B that once ticked like a metronome now hiccups. Without a crisp crossing of a fix, no beam, no fan marker, the crew relies on best estimates. The FO updates the ETA to the next beacon and rehearses the position report in his head. The captain considers a heading nudge to recenter the needle, then decides to trust the compass and let the needle earn back its credibility over the next minute. Choices like this are sensible in context and expensive in hindsight. A longer stay in convective air extracts a toll. Turbulence drags on energy, not just in indicated speed, but in attention. The DC-4's engines are faithful, yet piston management at night in rain corners bandwidth. Small pitch corrections compound. A couple of knots bleed off here, then are clawed back there. The airplane is still under control. Nothing dramatic announces itself. But the corridor they intended to fly narrows with each minute of uncertainty, like a funnel turned upside down. The lower they are, the less horizon there is to read, and the more any lateral drift threatens to move them away from the search grid that will later be flown as if the plan had remained intact. Every escalation has a beat that looks ordinary in the log and pivotal in the reconstruction. Perhaps it is a heading tweak to skirt a hard bump that coincides with a skywave-induced ADF error. Perhaps a power change to keep speed that lowers the rate of descent, just as a favorable wind shift would have carried them toward their intended fix, and now doesn't. The crew stays within the rules. The callouts are professional, and nothing they do would be flagged by an instructor without the God's eye view of the storm. Yet from that God's eye view, which the 1950 cockpit absolutely lacked, the track peels away from the ideal line just enough to matter. The absence of a mayday does not imply denial or neglect. It reflects the brutal arithmetic of bandwidth, a second pair of hands occupied by attitude, a mouth that would prefer to speak but a brain that prioritizes flying the machine, and a problem set that is ambiguous rather than singular. In such nights, crews wait for one more data point before committing to a radio call. One more flash, one more needle settle, one more feel of the air. Sometimes that point never arrives. What the search will inherit hours later is the assumption that the planned corridor remained the flown corridor and a meticulously plotted grid that never quite touches the quiet arc drawn here in darkness. At night, convective weather hides its architecture. Over late June Lake Michigan, relatively warm water can feed up drafts that tilt and smear a squall line. Instead of a clean wall, you get embedded cells inside widespread rain. Flat on radar mosaics we have today, but in 1950 only hinted at by lightning rhythm and rain intensity on the windscreen. Updrafts and downdrafts arrive as vertical jolts, with gust fronts that change the wind's direction and speed in seconds. A pilot descending to escape the worst of the tops may drop into a layer where the turbulence eases briefly, then sharpens again as an eddy rolls off a cell's flank. That calm window can be misleading. It encourages a continuation in a narrow lane that might be drifting sideways with the storm's motion. On screen, simple cross-section of a squall line over a lake, updraft, downdraft, gust front arrows, embedded cell callouts. The automatic direction finder, ADF, homes on non-directional beacons, NDBs, low-frequency radio stations that, by day, send a stable ground wave along the surface. At night, the ionosphere reflects some of that energy back to Earth as skywave. Over water, a good conductor, the receiver can hear both paths at once. Result, the ADF needle hunts or settles a few degrees away from truth. Add thunderstorm static, broadband noise from lightning, and the needle's damping can lag or jitter at the worst moment. Pilots learn to treat the needle as advisory and cross-check with time-distance math. If your ground speed is X, you should reach fixed Y in Z minutes. But turbulence alters true airspeed. Winds aloft alter ground speed. And the clock you're mentally solving can slip. At night, with no external horizon and no moving map display, a 2-degree bias over minutes can nudge a track away from a planned corridor just enough to complicate any search grid built on the plan rather than the drifted reality. On screen, animated ADF card, true bearing versus indicated, ground wave plus sky wave overlay, lightning icon when jitter appears. In piston transports, icing is a performance tax. Roughness on airfoils, added weight, and higher drag. Engine handling can suffer if intake air cools near visible moisture. Crews often descend to warmer layers where ice sheds and turbulence softens. But descending at night in convective weather trades a broader view for a narrower margin. You reduce glide options, compressed terrain, and obstacle clearance buffers over shoreline approaches, and expose yourself longer to sheer layers and rain-induced illusions. If the air below is only marginally smoother, the descent buys comfort without certainty, and may extend time in the weather, increasing cumulative drift from winds you can't easily visualize. The logic is sound. The risk is cumulative. On-screen, side profile of altitude bands, tops, icing layer, warmer layer, pros issues cons bullets, simple energy bars showing margin shrink with altitude. That's the surgical toolkit our story needs. How storms behave at night, how ADF can lie just a little, and why descending can be reasonable yet risky. On a good night, piston airliners are orchestras. The captain sets tempo, the first officer keeps time, the engines hum in concert. In weather, the score changes, workload spikes, and the band starts improvising. What makes the Flight 2501 timeline plausible isn't recklessness. It's how normal pilots manage abnormal ambiguity with 1950 tools. Fatigue and vigilance. This was a late leg. Fatigue doesn't announce itself with yawns. It narrows attentional bandwidth. Scans grow more tunneled. Pitch, power, performance get priority while peripheral cues, a slowly drifting ADF bearing, a subtle wind shift, fight to be noticed. Fatigue also nudges risk calculus. Let's get below this, feels proportionate when bumps are relentless. Communication under load. Pre-CRM era crews still distributed tasks. The captain flies, the FO works radios and charts. In convective bumps, even reading back a clearance takes extra seconds. You want to be exact, you fight the shaking, you time transmissions between carrier breaks. Non-urgent calls, advise position, or confirm fix, slide a minute, then two. The absence of a mayday is not denial, it's a choice to fly first, talk second when the problem isn't neatly nameable. Ambiguous instruments. The ADF needle that wanders a few degrees doesn't scream danger, it whispers, update your mental picture. Humans are poor at weighting small biases over long intervals. Confirmation bias will favor the compass, the more solid instrument, especially when the needle has already been misbehaving in lightning. Plan continuation bias. The original intent, cross the lake on a known corridor, anchors decisions. Each minute invested in the descent increases the psychological cost of reversing it. If a brief lull arrives, the brain tags it as progress, not coincidence. Where threading it becomes the story, even if the lane is drifting. Skill versus system knowledge. Piston handling at night in bumps is skill heavy. Throttle finesse, pitch damping, trim discipline. Those skills keep the airplane safe moment to moment. But the problem is strategic. Weather geometry and radio propagation. Skill can mask strategy drift. You're flying beautifully, in a slightly wrong direction. Social, operational pressures, schedules, passenger comfort, and a company culture of press on within reason, don't force bad choices, they tilt priorities. Below is smoother, aligns with comfort and often safety. That alignment makes the choice feel doubly justified. In sum, no single human error, rather a stack, fatigue, bandwidth, ambiguous cues, plan anchoring, nudging a reasonable crew a few degrees in a few minutes off the ideal path. When the search grid later assumes the ideal, those nudges matter. On-screen suggestions, subtle attention bandwidth, bar, captions for key cognitive traps, tunneled scan, confirmation, plan continuation, paraphrased radio lines in lower thirds, from what to why. The official record preserved the broad contours, a night crossing over Lake Michigan on June 24, 1950, a routine descent request, then an aircraft that never arrived. The investigation gathered radio notes, weather observations, witness statements along the shore, and later search logs that documented a wide, multi-day effort by air and boat. What the files lack, no FDR, no cockpit recorder, is exactly what our reconstruction must rebuild. Energy, track, and storm geometry. Weather rebuild. Modern reanalysis lets us sketch the environment aloft, a sheared summer setup with embedded convection. Surface stations along the western shore recorded gust fronts and pressure jumps consistent with a line that tilted over the lake. Aloft winds likely veered with height, meaning a descent would rotate the wind vector the airplane felt, altering ground speed and drift in ways not obvious without a moving map. That aligns with a cockpit experience of brief lulls punctuated by renewed bumps. You descend into a relative minimum, then encounter the next eddy as the line modulates. Navigation constraints. The route depended on NDB fixes and time-distance math. Night sky wave over a conductive surface can deflect an ADF bearing by a small but consequential angle. In gentle weather, that bias is corrected by patient averaging and clean fix crossings. In convective rain, the averaging breaks, needle damping lags, lightning adds crackling interference, and the airplane itself is busy riding out vertical gusts. A 2-degree bias sustained over minutes does not feel like a wrong turn. It feels like normal hunting. The crew could have been nominally on course by compass, yet geographically offset, sliding laterally relative to the corridor the search grid assumed. Search geometry. The search was large and methodical, aircraft and vessels flying in steaming grid patterns over water they believed contained the wreck. Grids are only as smart as their centroid and span. If the centroid is placed on a planned track, not the drifted reality, coverage looks comforting on paper and misses in practice, especially if the drift pushed the aircraft toward areas where debris transport is complex. Lake currents, wind-driven surface drift, and summer thermals create filaments that can disperse floating evidence into ribbons few hundred meters wide, not blankets kilometers across. Search logs show extensive effort, not a lack of will, but effort confronted by geometry, a grid hinged a few miles from where it needed to be, and a debris field that may have been thin, mobile, and short-lived. What the absence implies: a common inference. No mayday means an instantly catastrophic failure. That can be true, but not uniquely true. Another pathway is bandwidth theft, an extended, ambiguous struggle that absorbed attention until something abrupt ended the opportunity to speak. The scattered recovery of items days later is compatible with a localized impact that produced debris too sparse or transient for the early grid to intersect. Without a hull, cause certainty is out of reach, but the pattern, storm, night, ADF bias, descent for smoother air, picks out the highest probability drivers the data allows. Ruling out the obvious traps. Explosion narratives thrive in silence, but no distinctive residue or consistent witness light signatures emerged that would anchor such a claim. Hijack intent narratives do not fit the radio cadence prior to silence or the operational context. Fuel exhaustion is inconsistent with planning norms and the timing of the descent. None of these are impossible. They are simply less supported by what the period evidence can bear. What the data says we missed. The search should have worked if the corridor remained the corridor and if debris behaved like a stationary target. The data argues both ifs failed. A small navigational bias plus wind drift can move a track far enough that a grid anchored to the plan becomes orthogonal to reality. And on a summer lake in convective weather, a light debris field can be shredded and invected faster than sorties can be tasked. Neither factor is dramatic. Both are sufficient. On-screen suggestions, simple animation, planned corridor versus drifted path, grid laid on plan missing the true arc, arrows for surface drift, reanalysis cross-section of the line, lower third citations of period documents. Stay high, more vantage, more tops, sustained turbulence, icing risk if temps permit, likely remain nearer the planned corridor. Step down chosen. Seek warmer, smoother air, reduces vantage, rotates wind vector, increases time and weather, raises reliance on ADF bearing subject to night skywave. Trust compass likely, holds intended heading. If the ADF is biased, lateral offset accumulates quietly. Chase needle. Needle wander in lightning can induce S-turns and over-control. In 1950 training, conservative practice is to trust compass and cross-check with time. Declare early, ATC gets a breadcrumb. Cockpit workload increases mid-problem. Wait, likely. Conserve bandwidth to fly. If the one more data point never resolves, radio silence persists until an abrupt endpoint. Synthesis. 3 reasonable choices. Descend, hold compass, wait for clarity, combine into a path that drifts just enough from the plan to evade a search built on that plan. None is negligent, all are context-good decisions. The tragedy is not willful, it's geometric. On screen, 3 tiles with if-then arrows, the chosen branch highlighted. Note at bottom, context, good outcome, good. By dawn and into the following days, the lake gave back little. Aircraft and boats traced meticulous grids. Spotters scanned for slicks or clusters. Some items were recovered, solemn pieces that confirmed loss without yielding location. The absence of a main wreck became the story within the story, a search that looked correct, performed by professionals, and yet empty-handed. Families faced a void deeper than water, no site to hold, no place to anchor ritual. Investigators documented every sortie, every weather update, every call, an archive of effort that concludes with uncertainty. In time, the case aged into a regional legend, but legends over-explain. The more honest closing is that night, storm physics, and 1950 navigation limits can erase footprints even when you look hard and long. We hold the language plain here. Lives were lost, lessons were paid for. Our task is to carry the learning forward, not to dramatize the pain. Weather geometry matters, even without pictures. Training that treats line structure, gust fronts, and shear as three-dimensional problems helps crews weigh the real cost of a descent for comfort. Night ADF discipline. ADF can lie a little at night. Procedures that emphasize compass trust, time-distance cross-checks, and skepticism when lightning jitters, the needle reduce lateral drift in exactly the conditions most likely to produce it. Search planning humility. Grids feel scientific. They inherit assumptions. Anchoring on planned tracks instead of probabilistic drift envelopes can leave holes big enough for a wreck to hide. Modern SAR uses leeway and drift models. Cases like this explain why. Human factors, literacy. Plan continuation, confirmation bias, and bandwidth limits don't disappear with experience. Naming them gives crews the language to pause, declare uncertainty sooner, or reverse a descent that isn't delivering clarity. Technology gap lessons. Airborne weather radar, later commonplace, dramatically improved night storm awareness. Remembering the pre-radar era guards against judging 1950 crews by 2025 tools and reminds us to teach principles, not just displays. On-screen, checklist card with 5 icons, succinct phrasing suitable for a freeze frame. Storm, night, and the limits of 1950 navigation turned a straightforward corridor into a question that still echoes over Lake Michigan. The search was earnest. The geometry was unkind. If this reconstruction gave you a clearer map of that night, explore our next investigation. Another open water disappearance where small biases grew into big outcomes. Subscribe for more data-driven aviation mysteries and find all sources we used linked below.